I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Next up is Rosemarie Macqueen. Simon mentioned before, and I will repeat that she's with the city of Westminster, which is actually what most of us American hicks think of as London. It's got all the stuff we think of when we think of London, you know, Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament and the Abbey and things like that. And I'm sure West End theaters, I'm sure Rosemarie will quickly rattle off everything else that I've not mentioned that also belongs in Westminster. So we thought that we should have Westminster in the context that, you know, that there are another 32 boroughs, just as there are another 4 boroughs in New York, even though too many non-New Yorkers think of us only as Manhattan. Rosemarie is the strategic director for built environment for the city of Westminster. All those planning applications for what, you know, us American hicks think of as London go through Rosemarie's hands. She is extremely well regarded throughout the UK as like the leading borough planning official. When we met other borough planning officials, they all kind of oohed and ahed that we'd gotten to meet Rosemarie Macqueen, who has also been instrumental in putting together this program. Rosemarie.
Well, thank you very much for the generous words, Hope. And good morning. I'm really pleased to be here to echo what Simon said. It's been the most hospitable few days so far, and there's still days to come. I hope, can someone wave in the back row if you aren't hearing anything I'm saying? Can you hear in the back? Fine. Okay, good. I almost feel that it's impossible for me to speak, bearing in mind what Amanda's just said, because it's almost like there's an echo of policy making between the two cities, which must be good, because we think our policies are right, and already Amanda is using the same kind of policy base to make sure that our cities are resilient, agile, moving into the 21st century, which is where they need to be. So just a few words, yes, about Westminster and why I'm sitting here as only one of the 33 London boroughs. I mean, maybe say that I'm a bit like most of Manhattan, although I think the City Corporation, the square mile for finance, would like to badge themselves into that as well, but unluckily they didn't get the invite, although I'm sure someone in the front row could say something about that. So you'll recognise London as a world city, but I think what you're really recognising is my borough, Westminster. It is the seat of the church, the seat of the crown, the seat of the state, so all the government precincts, House of Parliament, most of the royal palaces are in my area, and most of the main cathedral and abbey churches are there. It's also the area where an international office market is based, a particular one, which I'll come back to, but we do have financial business, not the large floor plates in the City of London, but other ones, which I have to say have coped much better with this recession, luckily for us. Creative industries, we have one of the largest creative industry bases in the world, and I can say that because all of our research is independently done and assessed. We also have large sectors for education. You've heard about universities and colleges, which themselves have obviously administration attached to them, and also large medical centres. So for all those reasons, it is an extraordinarily busy environment in terms of jobs. But those jobs are added to by the fact that we have 8,000 retail shops. We have more retail offer for you at a very cheap rate at the moment than Rome, Milan and Paris put together, so come shopping. We have 3,000 restaurants, we have 500 bars, we have 1,000 licensed restaurants and clubs operating. So again, when we were talking about do you want a night out in Geneva or London, I think you want it in London, aka the West End. We have the largest number of the concert halls. The Albert Hall is within our area, the Royal Opera House. We also have a number of museums, the art galleries, the National Gallery, the Tate Britain, and also the edgier ones, Royal Academy and Courtauld perhaps more traditional, but things like the White Cube. So when we talk about the art market, it's significant. Christie's, Sotheby's are all in Westminster. So there's another element of our trading base there. Tourism, 40% of London's hotels are within Westminster, and they are large employers, and large employees also of people who are less skilled. So there's a direct relationship between there and some of our residents. We also have a great environment, not unsurprisingly. I'll come back to the heritage later, but we have a large amount of open space. We have 4 out of the 5 royal parks within our area. We have 70 London squares. So there's a contribution in terms of European landscape tradition that you actually see and is part of the ambience and invite of Westminster. I see my job principally as one of, as Namandra has said, some of these names, these words, because these are words that planners are using nowadays. We're making places, we're placemaking, we're involved in well-being of the citizenry, and well-being is not just healthy living and walking, but it's also to do with actually the idea of you being a person that has respect for yourself when you actually earn money and you can pay the rent. So all of those things combined together are part of what planning is now involved in. It's not just the use of buildings, it's not just new buildings, it's actually to do with all those connections between the third-party sectors and between the other major public operators within the field, whether it's the Metropolitan Police or it's the NHS. And again, I can say something about that. But I see basically that I'm looking at making policies that are right and are fit for purpose by consultation with all the people that are actually going to be involved in the decision making that comes then after the policy making. So policy making, decision making, we are the busiest planning authority in the country, dealing with something like 11,000 planning applications a year. We're not the biggest because we're also, I like to say, we're one of the most efficient. So we actually run a very tight ship because the authority is a tightly budgeted, constrained authority that I work for. So we write policies, but we also are involved in things like local area renewal partnerships, action plans, and also bids. We've certainly learnt from you, I understand, that New York is in the position of having 60 bids. Well, we're a bit sort of junior to that. We've got 3 active bids at the moment and 3 that are on the stocks, but we were almost the first to get there in terms of bids, and we certainly have some of the biggest. And as I said, Dame Judith is in the front row, who was ex-City Corporation, now running in partnership with ourselves, the new West End company that runs part of the West End. So I kind of see that the planning adventure that we're embarked on in Westminster, there's a triangulation around it of 3 things. One is to do with economy, one is to do with the environment, and one is to do with our residents. And those are often in tension, and it's actually trying to get not necessarily the maximum for all of them, but the optimum out of all of those in terms of long-term sustainability of the way our area is going to develop. So thinking about just the economy then, I talked about financial businesses. Now, the reason that we have come out of the recession faster than anyone else, which is always, when we go back to learn from history what has happened in the past, is because our planning policies, although they were attacked at the time, did not allow large floor-plate banking after Big Bang. We said, no, that's not the subtlety of where Westminster is. Indeed, something like 75% of the businesses, the 47,000 businesses in Westminster, have less than 5 employees. Now, what happens in Big Bang, when you had the Lehman Brothers, you had the big things like Bank of America, you had whole streets in the city, whole office blocks going dead, which meant that also the support industries of the photocopying shop, the coffee bars, the restaurants, etc., went down as well. Now, you didn't get that in Westminster because what we've concentrated on is equity banking and also hedge funds, so much more flexibility. And of course, some of those have gone down in the current climate, but other startups have come in behind them. We also talked about the creative industry. So our planning policies have to support those creative industries, to do with advertising, to do with post-production, and to do with the kind of intellectual seed bedding that goes on. A direct relationship, of course, there between making sure that you embed your universities and your colleges as well, and you make connections between them, because if you have students coming to live and study in Westminster, you want them to stay, so that there's an intellectual capital, which is one of the reasons that people want to locate their offices within Westminster. I've talked about the service industries, but I haven't talked perhaps about the 24-hour economy. Licensing changes a few years ago in the UK meant that because we had so many restaurants and bars, that there was, and there's obviously a pull to come into the West End to recreate, a lot of those went late night opening, early morning opening, or indeed open all the time. Now, one of the things, before I come to the residential opportunities in Westminster, is that we look at a multi-use city. We want our residents driven through, living right in the heart of the capital. Indeed, in a sense, some of the Jane Jacobs things are certainly the things that we see as actually being a very healthy way of living. But it does have penalties. So if I have 30,000 people that live in Soho, you all know what Soho is like, it's actually a very vibrant nighttime economy. How do I make that balance environmentally, which allows them the 5 hours uninterrupted sleep that the World Health Organization now wants them? How do I make sure that there's a politeness between the people running those bars, that they stop scraping metal tables and chairs outside people's bedroom windows? So those kind of complexities do come with the joy and advantages of having residents right the way throughout the city. On the environmental side of that triangulation, again, advantages, because if we have only 12 square miles for my city, if we have residents living cheek by jowl with these 24-hour businesses, then we have people available to staff those businesses again. It also means that we get advantages in terms of moving towards combined cooling, heat and power in the future. And because we have the metro running underneath this, we can actually start doing cooling and heating between the two. So we are looking at long-term and medium-term in terms of making sure that plants around the city will be able to provide for energy uses within the city. But we're also having to look at the fact that we're a heat island, as unfortunately in terms of carbon, the city heats up. We are an island within a heat island of London, and so how are we dealing with that? And we are doing all the things that we're talking about. We have biodiversity policies, we have green roofs. We're looking at grow bag allotments. Yes, of course there are some vacant sites now, but what we're trying to do is get community engagement and get people to do grow bag temporary allotments, because so many people are interested in gardening, getting dirty, youth, etc. All sorts of people are interested in that. We even gave planning permission for beehives on top of a rather posh retail shop called Fortnum & Mason's relatively recently. So people are doing things that I think 10 years ago people might have thought were a joke. Also looking in terms of transport infrastructure, because I have to link in with Traffic for London, Transport for London, which is within Simon's area, but we are looking at Crossrail. More Crossrail stations will be within Westminster, and so we're looking for the best architecture and the best opportunity there, because it will be bringing people in not just from London, but from Berkshire, beyond, from Kent, bringing them in to be having jobs in London. Residential, the last side of that triangulation. This is quite interesting, again, that tension. I have only 250,000 residents within Westminster, but every day Westminster has just over 1 million people coming in to do work, to study, to go to the cinema, to enjoy restaurants, etc. And that balance between the two is quite complicated because, as you may know, businesses don't have a vote. So my councillors, the elected politicians who make the decisions, do have an electorate that is entirely residential. So that's an interesting tension that they have to look at. And within those residents, again, uniquely in Westminster, we have a much higher proportion of private rented than you do get in the rest of the UK. 10% private rented, we have over 30% private rented, 30% social rented, 30% privately owned housing in Westminster. And of course, if the city has got to grow in the future, we have got to face up to produce the right kind of policies for affordable housing. So planning does deliver a large proportion of affordable housing. If you get a commercial extension within Westminster, once it's over quite a low threshold, 200 square metres, we start to look for residential use. If you have over 10 units of residential, then we start to look for affordable housing as well as private housing. So that's how we begin to build up the opportunities for affordable housing. But we're also now looking very closely, our new policies are looking at intermediate housing, because affordable housing basically looks at or provides for people who are coming off the homeless register, and quite often for people in long-term worklessness. What about the nurses, the policemen, the teachers? Where are they going to live if they would like to live close to their jobs? So we are looking at things like shared equity and other shared ownership for that middle category, and it is extraordinarily difficult to be able to deliver on that. We even have, as I say, policies for rough sleeping. There is a bed for every rough sleeper in Westminster, and there is also a drying out programme and a drugs programme that goes with that, which is inserted within the planning policy. So if people sleep on the streets, they are sleeping on the street because they wish to, not because there actually isn't a bed which will then get them through those stages. So I think I've obviously perhaps taken up my time. Local distinctiveness was mentioned by Amanda, and that is also a crucial feature in terms of our planning policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemarie. I can already see the seeds of the conversation that's going to come up next. But first, we want to kind of come full circle. The title of this panel is Planning to Compete in the Global Marketplace. And I've asked our final panelist, Robert Yaro, the president of the Regional Plan Association, to talk about that. Regional Plan Association is, of course, the oldest and best known research and advocacy organization on planning issues, and has been doing plans for what we used to call the tri-state area, and now I guess we call the New York mega region, and now branching out to other mega regions and recognizing global mega regions and the future of cities throughout. And maybe you can say talk about the global marketplace and these two cities in their place in it.
Makes us sound megalomaniacal, I guess, but at any rate, and we continue to be focused primarily on the New York metropolitan area, the tri-state region that Ken referred to briefly. And it's kind of striking, by the way, in the discussions about London, that no one's referred to what Sir Peter Hall calls Roseland. They don't even have a name for it. The rest of southeastern England, and it's one of the things that is so clearly parallel to the economic geography of the New York metropolitan area, that there's this larger place with 22 million people here, about 20 million people in Roseland, and that's the real metropolitan area. That's the real economic unit. That's the housing market. That's the labor market. And that's the place that the people in the burbs think of themselves here as New Yorkers. That's what you tell the person on the plane next to you. If you live in Stamford or Newark, you tell them you're a New Yorker. And of course, you're Yankee fans and watch we all live with the same realities of metropolitan life. And so one of the messages, I think, from me is that we need to be thinking at that larger scale. And so, for example, the discussion this morning, the brief interaction between Mayor Bloomberg and the homeless advocate about affordable housing. New York City has had for more than a generation the most robust affordable housing investment strategy of any city in America for many, many years. We were spending more than the rest of urban America combined on affordable housing. And the fact is that the city itself, the 5 boroughs of New York City, can't meet the housing needs of a metropolitan region in which we've got 925 municipalities, and 900 of them pulled up the drawbridge to multifamily housing, to affordable housing, to rental housing, and so forth, which puts extraordinary pressures on the center city. And I'm sure the same thing's going on in Westminster and in central London that's going on here. I digress. First, Hope asked me to find some common threads in the discussions today and that we've been having over the past few days. And first, I think one of the most important lessons is that New York and London are peers and not competitors. And there was a period a year or two ago when folks were looking at M&A activity and foreign exchange markets and say, my God, London's bigger and in financial markets than we are. They must be competitors. We must do something about it. Well, in fact, each one has its own distinctive role in global markets. They're complementary, not competitive for the most part. And I think the most important thing, as Ken pointed out, these cities are bookends, that they are the co-capitals of the global economy and global culture and media, and they have this very special role in global markets. And the question before us is how to sustain the role of both of these places as the two great world cities, the leading great world cities. How do we learn from each other? How do we collaborate with each other when it's appropriate? I think one of the things that we need to be looking in the rearview mirror as New Yorkers in particular, that for 60, 70 years, Ken, the U.S. economy was so paramount in the global economy. New York's the nation's economic capital, that we could be kind of lazy and not really have to think about competing, but that's no longer the case. That there are a lot of countries and a lot of cities coming up behind us that in fact would like very much to take at least some of our role in global markets, and we need to be competing in a way that perhaps we haven't been. We need to hustle. We can't be sitting on our assets the way that we might otherwise like to. The other thing that I'd say is that these cities are remarkably resilient, and when we haven't made investments, Crossrail and the 2nd Avenue subway have time-honored histories. They're also bookends. They run across the center of the central business district. They're fundamental to unkinking the existing transit systems, and government in both places has managed not to make these investments or to put the finances behind them until very recently, in the case of 2nd Avenue subway, for 50 years. And Crossrail, I guess it's been 20 or 30 years that it's been kicked around, and now finally central government and the mayor's office have made this commitment to do it. So at any rate, if we're thinking about some of the common themes, I identified five points in the discussions yesterday and today that I think I would like to lay out as being at the core of strategies for both New York and London to remain at the pinnacle of the global economy, retain the place that we have now, so that looking back, a conference here at Columbia a century from now or 90 years from now could look back and say, well, how did New York and London sustain this unique place in global markets and the global economy? And the first one, as we've heard from a number of the speakers, is the fundamental asset of these places is that we're really good at attracting and retaining the most talented people. Talented entrepreneurial people drive innovation. Innovation is what you need if we're going to stay ahead of the curve, if you're going to stay ahead of Mumbai and Shanghai and Singapore and all the other places that would like to clean our clock. Here in New York, the wonderful thing is that it seems that every 24-year-old in America wants to live in Brooklyn, and increasingly that's where they do live, and they bring their talent and entrepreneurship with them. And one of the big challenges facing, and they're here, why are they here? They're here because the city has edge. It's not an inexpensive or an easy place to live. As I said yesterday in one of the forums, that if you're looking for a comfortable, easy place to live, there's Oklahoma City and Topeka and Kansas City. Kansas City is a really nice place, nice, easy place to live. Doesn't cost that much, and I really like Kansas City. But if you're 24 years old and you want to change the world, you probably aren't going to Kansas City. You're going to Brooklyn, or you're going to London. And the things so maintaining that edge, maintaining this, some of it has to do with this unique sense of place, being in the center of things. In New York, I think as much, maybe more than anywhere else, including London, the streets literally vibrate with energy and excitement, and that's what attracts bright entrepreneurial people. But we can't take that for granted, and I think the Quality of Life campaign that Mayor Bloomberg has undertaken. It made it very clear this is not a frill. This is at the very heart of an economic development strategy for New York, and it's broadly defined as ranging from affordable housing to quality public spaces to reclaiming the public realm. The Times Square experiment needs to be replicated across the city as we reclaim unused space from automobiles and trucks and so forth for people and for bicycles, and it's a big part of the public realm strategy, a big part of a quality of life strategy that we need to pursue here in New York. London's had a very similar strategy. I was struck when I was there last year, and came up at Piccadilly Circus, and instead of finding the statue of Eros in a traffic island as it had been for a century, it's now a part of a wonderful new urban plaza and a place that's filled with people just about 24 hours a day. You've got this little problem where your tube closes at night. We'll talk about that. But it's also, going back to the region, it's also access to countryside and clean air and clean water. And one of New York's great, part of our amenity package is that we've got the Hudson Valley and the Catskills and New England countryside and the great estuaries of Long Island Sound and the Upper and Lower Bay. They're right here, and they're accessible and they're clean again for the first time in a century. And we have to make sure that that New Yorkers have access to them and that these things remain clean and attractive and so forth. A second strategy, and just reminding myself sitting here in this great institution of higher education that this is another one of those things that's not a frill, it's not an afterthought, that having great universities and great medical research and scientific research institutes is part of the bedrock of the competitiveness of New York and London. And just for the Brits, in case you're wondering why there are more crowns behind us on this screen than any place in London, it's because this institution, going back to the roots of this institution and the connections between New York and London, was founded by George II in 1754, chartered by George II as King's College. And we had this little difference of opinion about 20 years later about what the name should be, I guess, and it's now Columbia. But there's a long tradition here of investing in both public and private higher education. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the much beloved former senator from New York, was John Kennedy's ambassador to India in the early 1960s, and he was asked in Bombay, now Mumbai, I think it was in '62, he was at a public forum, and somebody asked him what Bombay needed to do to become a great world city, and he had a great sense of humor, but a sense of history and perspective, and a former Harvard professor, so his response was, well, it's really very simple. He said, build 2 world-class universities and wait 200 years. And unfortunately, places like Shanghai and Beijing and Mumbai took that advice very seriously. They're building those universities. They don't intend to wait 200 years. And again, the competition's in the rearview mirror. And so the new campus that Senator Bollinger referenced just north of here, Columbia, is literally doubling the size of its campus. It's creating a great new research campus just north of here. A very controversial thing, and the good news is that the city government and the business and civic communities of the city got together with Columbia to help support that and to overcome the NIMBY opposition. NYU has the same challenges, the new school, City University. These things always create NIMBY opposition, but we have to understand that these places, these institutions are just fundamental to the economic success of New York and London. It's a big part of what attracts the best and the brightest to New York. It's a big part of what creates the technologies that sustain our economic base. And so continuing to invest in these institutions gets me back to 2 other thoughts, and that is that education doesn't start at the undergraduate level. The city's commitment to rebuilding the New York City public schools, and I'm a proud alumnus of PS 99 and New York City high schools and so forth. These are great institutions. They languished for a generation or longer. The city is now recommitted to rebuilding K through 12 education, and it's something that's going to take a generation to overcome the neglect of the generation that allowed them to run down in the first place. And then finally, a thought is that we've got to deal with immigration policy, that the openness and tolerance that Ken and both mayors talked about as the fundamental assets of these cities in Europe and in Washington, in Brussels and in Washington. There are forces that will pull up the drawbridge to immigrants. And we simply can't allow that to happen. We have a special problem here in the United States where it's really perverse. This institution will spend $250,000 educating a single PhD candidate or a single medical student. And if they're from outside the United States, they're handed 1 document at commencement, and that is a diploma. And then literally a week or 2 later, they'll receive a notice that their visa is running out and it's time to leave. I'm going to suggest today that we change that and have 2 documents in the little packet. And one of them would be a diploma, and the second one would be a green card for anybody that wants to stay. And I don't understand why we wouldn't do it that way. Why wouldn't we want to welcome these folks after that we've spent 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 years educating them, and so forth. So investing in eds and meds and making sure that the graduates of these places are able to stick around. A third thing, again, going back to housing affordability, not just the 140,000 units, which are fundamental to the success of the city's affordability strategy, but this is a place where we really need to cooperate at a regional scale. And we're going to get some help, we're getting some help from the federal government for the first time maybe ever. It got headlines in Westchester, not so much here in the city, a few weeks ago when the federal government insisted that Westchester communities that have been excluding low-income and minority residents for decades let down the drawbridge and make affirmative commitments to expanding the supply of rental housing and affordable housing for minorities and immigrants and other groups. And we need to replicate that across the metropolitan area so that it isn't just New York City that's trying to meet the region's housing needs. I'm really concerned that if we don't do this when the housing market comes roaring back, that we'll see another spike in housing prices that will make it difficult for those young people to stay here. Two other things. We've talked about infrastructure. It's about a $50 billion investment program that's underway. 4 mega projects, 2nd Avenue Subway, the East Side Access that brings Long Island Railroad into Grand Central, opens up the opportunities that the mayor talked about for transforming southern, eastern, northeastern Queens and parts of Brooklyn with Long Island Railroad service. We'll have the capacity to do that and have that system work for New York City residents as well as Long Island residents. The ARC Tunnel from New Jersey, which doubles capacity under the Hudson. But we've had business leaders and some political leaders saying maybe we can't afford to do these things in a down economy. The mayor isn't saying that, but his colleagues in Albany have been saying that, and we can't allow that to happen. We've got to move ahead with these projects in much the same way that Sir Simon mentioned that Crossrail has to be built if we're going to create the capacity for the next million New Yorkers. It's really 4 million people we need to find room for in the region, 3 million jobs in the region, 750,000 of them here in the core of the region. And the last thing is that planning matters, as we've heard from all of the speakers, that the work that the GLA is doing, the City of Westminster, the City Planning Commission, Amanda's work here in New York, that planning and the zoning work. Now, come on, it's not just rezoning. It's replanning whole districts of the city and creating the plans that have never existed before. And it starts with an understanding of what the infrastructure needs are, what the urban design strategies need to be. It's an inclusive process. At any rate, planning matters. And the London plan, and I would argue that we should broaden out the next version of Plan YC that will be adopted in 2011, needs to broaden its purview to include an understanding of the kind of broader context for the rezoning processes that are going to begin, and of course a reaffirmation of the climate strategies, the carbon strategies. So 5 things that I think we need to do is quality of life's the key, retaining the best and the brightest, sustaining our openness and tolerance to immigrants wherever they come from, improving K through 12 and promoting the continued excellence of institutions like this one and the other great institutions of higher education and research, promoting regional housing affordability, building capacity for growth in our infrastructure systems, and finally, creating and then implementing the long-range plans and the climate strategies. Those are the things that we're going to need to keep these places at the pinnacle of the global economy. Thank you.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.